The execution was clean, but someone returned and left a glove. Welcome to Vale Files. I am your host, Thorn. It's always a thrill hearing from you. Where are you watching from today? Thanks for being part of this journey. Let's begin. It was on a damp and blustery afternoon in early November that the curious affair of the glove left at the Gallows first touched the threshold of 221 B Baker Street. The fire had been stoked to a pleasant crackle, and I, having no pressing cases of my own, was contentedly reading over my medical journals while Holmes paced the rug with his usual restless intensity. He had been moody all morning, brushing aside my attempts at conversation with little more than a grunt or raised eyebrow. It was only when a sharp knock echoed at the door that his eyes lit up with interest. Mrs. Hudson, ever discreet and motherly in her manners, appeared a moment later with a visiting card on a silver tray. Holmes took it between two fingers as though it were a playing card in a high-stakes game. "Inspector Tobias Gregson," he read aloud, casting me a glance. "Our esteemed colleague from Scotland Yard, Watson. Pray let us see what wind has blown him to our door on a weekday at this hour." Gregson entered in haste, his cheeks red from the wind, and his brow drawn with professional tension. "I won't mince words, Holmes," he began, not bothering to remove his coat. "We've got a real devil of a case, found this morning at Newgate Prison. Man hanged himself, so we thought, until we noticed a few things didn't quite fit. The chap was a court clerk named Raymond Davies. Clean record, quiet life, no cause for suicide. And then—" Here Gregson produced a small parcel from his pocket and unfolded it carefully. This glove, left hanging on the gallows beam, placed very deliberately. No fingerprints. No owner. Holmes peered at it with keen interest. It was a lady's glove, white, kid leather, delicately stitched, but with a single speck of what looked like dried mud on the wrist. He did not touch it. Instead, he crouched beside the parcel and leaned in, his sharp nose mere inches away. "The glove is size 6.5, Holmes murmured. "Too large for a debutante, too small for a working woman. French manufacture, not older than 6 months, and this mark—" He pointed at the stain. Not mud, but clay, specifically from the banks of the Thames near Mill Wharf. "Tell me, Gregson, was the gallows used recently before this?" "Not in over a year. It's been kept locked. Prison renovation. We found no signs of forced entry." "Yet Mr. Davies found his way in," Holmes mused. "Or was taken." "Watson, I confess, I felt a chill at that moment. The prison was supposed to be one of the most secure structures in the city. The idea that someone could gain entry, execute a man in a supposed suicide, and leave behind such an odd token, a woman's glove, sent my imagination racing. "And no note?" Holmes continued. "None. But there was something else. His office at the Central Criminal Court was ransacked the night before. Files missing, one in particular, the records for a trial held 3 years ago, the Rosemere drowning case." Holmes stood so suddenly that his dressing gown flared behind him like a cape. "The Rosemere drowning, yes, I recall it. A woman stood accused of murdering her husband by pushing him into the Thames near Richmond. Acquitted, if memory serves, circumstantial evidence." "That's the one," Gregson confirmed, "and the woman vanished shortly after." "Vanished," Holmes echoed, "or was made to vanish." Holmes turned toward the window, the grey light outlining his lean figure. He stood silent for a moment before speaking again. "Gregson, you say the glove was left on the gallows beam itself?" "Right on the crossbar, tied in a neat little bow, like an invitation." "Then we must consider," Holmes said, "what invitation it truly is. Someone has left a message, but not for the Yard, for me." I started. "You believe this was meant for you?" "I believe," Holmes said quietly, "that someone wants me to unravel a wrong buried in the past. And that glove, His eyes gleamed. "Is not just a clue, Watson. It is a gauntlet." Holmes insisted we depart for Newgate Prison within the hour. The grey skies over London had darkened further, promising rain, but Holmes strode forward beneath his umbrella as if the weather were of no consequence. I struggled slightly to keep pace, my mind still lingering on the curious details. The suicide that wasn't, the missing court file, and most of all the pristine glove left like a symbol in a silent cathedral of punishment. "This case has an odour to it, Watson," Holmes muttered as we crossed Fleet Street. "Not the stench of crime alone, but the distinct aroma of orchestration. A stage has been set. The actor, Davies, is dead. The prop, a glove, deliberately chosen, but the playwright remains unseen." Inside Newgate, we were met by Warden Hollis, a broad-shouldered man with the complexion of someone who had seen more shadows than sunlight. He greeted Holmes with a strained nod and led us down a cold corridor that echoed our steps like the tick of a grim clock. "I found Davies myself," Hollis said, unlocking a rusted door. "He wasn't scheduled to be on site. He was last seen 2 nights ago leaving the Central Court. No one expected him here, let alone—" He trailed off as we entered the disused execution chamber. The air was thick, close, and faintly metallic. The gallows loomed like a skeletal relic at the far end. Holmes stepped forward immediately, ignoring the covered body that still lay beneath a shroud near the wall. The rope had been cut. A fragment dangled, knotted in a way that struck me as almost ceremonial. Holmes examined it wordlessly, then turned to the beam. The glove had been removed, but Gregson had thoughtfully left a chalk outline marking its precise location. "Left glove, tied by the wrist," Holmes murmured, "at precisely shoulder height, neatly knotted, suggesting time and care. This was not a message left in haste." He dropped to one knee and examined the floor. After a moment, he pointed to a faint line in the dust. "There." Someone moved a stool or box to reach the beam. "You see the scrape? Narrow, with a subtle arc. Not a prison stool, those are heavier, something lighter, portable." I knelt beside him and squinted. "You believe the murderer brought it with them?" "Or Davies did," Holmes replied, rising. "But I rather think not. Suicide is seldom so artistic, and no suicide leaves behind a lady's glove unless we are to believe in some doomed romanticism." Hollis looked shaken. "There's something else, Mr. Holmes. The prison was locked, as I told the inspector, but we found the records office key in Davies' coat pocket. Strange part is, he shouldn't have had one. All copies were collected after the closure." Holmes's expression darkened. Then either someone trusted him too much, or he took it from someone who shouldn't be trusted at all. He turned to the covered body and without hesitation lifted the sheet. Davies' face was pallid, almost peaceful, save for the bruising about his neck. Holmes examined the hands, the shoes, and finally the lining of the coat. From a hidden pocket near the hem, he retrieved a torn scrap of parchment, thin like archival paper. "Part of a case transcript?" Holmes murmured, reading. "Listen." The accused gave no verbal protest, but her gaze remained fixed upon the clerk throughout the proceedings. Curious. "And here, Exhibit B, a glove belonging to the deceased, found at the riverbank." He looked up. "Watson, I do believe our glove is a reappearance. But how? Surely the original would have been sealed in evidence." "Indeed. Which leads us to an even darker possibility, that someone kept it, or worse, replaced it. Let us speak with someone from the court who recalls the Rosemere case. I believe it's time we visited the clerk's office." We exited the prison as the first drops of rain began to fall, streaking the fogged windows of hansom cabs and sending street vendors scattering under awnings. By the time we reached the Central Criminal Court, the hour was approaching dusk. Holmes wasted no time. He strode into the administrative wing with the air of a man who owned it, and within minutes we were seated across from an elderly gentleman named Mortimer Bell, senior clerk and colleague to the late Mr. Davies. Bell had watery blue eyes and fingers stained permanently with ink. "A dreadful business," he said, shaking his head. "Raymond was steady, not brilliant, but careful. I never once suspected, well, anything like this." "You were both present at the Rosemere trial, were you not?" Holmes asked. Bell nodded slowly. "A tragic affair. Amelia Rosemere, charged with drowning her husband, a barrister. No witnesses, only circumstantial evidence. She claimed he fell during an argument. Body recovered 2 days later. No signs of struggle. The judge ruled her innocent, though I doubt anyone felt entirely satisfied." "Was Mr. Davies involved beyond routine clerking?" Holmes inquired. "Not officially," Bell replied, "but now that you mention it, I do recall him being shaken. He said something to me once. There's more in the margins than the record shows. I thought it just poetic nonsense." "Do you recall any unusual entries in the evidence log?" Bell furrowed his brow. "There was something odd. One exhibit, the glove you mentioned, it was logged but later retracted, replaced by a second glove. I assumed it a clerical error." "Was Amelia Rosemere's testimony ever called into question after the trial?" I asked. "Discreetly, yes. A few voices murmured about her sudden disappearance. She left London shortly after the verdict. No forwarding address. We assumed she wished to escape the scandal." Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled. "Thank you, Mr. Bell. You've been most helpful. One last question. Who had access to the court archive where the case files were kept?" Bell glanced sideways. "Only the clerks, myself, Davies, and Mr. Carraway." "And this Mr. Carraway, where might we find him?" "Gone to his estate in Surrey for the week," Bell said. "Family business, but he's expected back by Sunday." We took our leave as twilight crept over London. The gas lamps flared to life, casting wavering halos in the mist. As we stepped back onto the street, I turned to Holmes. "Do you think this Carraway might be involved?" Holmes was silent for a moment, then spoke quietly. "Carraway may be a red herring, or he may be the spider in the center of the web, but I am increasingly convinced of one thing." "What's that?" "That Davies did not go to the prison willingly. Someone brought him there, someone who knew the layout, who had access, and who carried with them a memory or a symbol from a trial meant to be buried." "And the glove?" Holmes tapped his cane against the pavement thoughtfully. "The glove is a symbol, Watson, a token left by someone who believes justice was not served. A woman disappeared, a man is now dead, and between them lies a secret stitched into kid leather. We must find Amelia Rosemere, or what remains of her." The rain had quickened, turning the cobbles slick and reflective. Holmes adjusted his collar against the chill and stepped toward the waiting cab. "Come, Watson, the past is not as dead as we would like to believe, and it seems it has risen, wearing white gloves." We climbed in, the horses clattering off toward Baker Street, while behind us the shadows of justice stirred once more. The journey back to Baker Street was quiet, save for the rhythmic clatter of hooves on wet stone and the occasional hiss of rain on the cab's canopy. Holmes sat opposite me, his eyes half closed and fingers steepled, lost in thought. I knew better than to interrupt. When Holmes entered such a state, it was as though he were sifting through the very structure of the case within his mind, slotting observations like bricks into an arch. He remained that way until the cab turned onto Baker Street. No sooner had we entered our sitting room than Holmes flung off his coat and reached for the thick index of the Times clippings he maintained with manic precision. He flipped through it rapidly, scanning headlines until he found what he sought. "Watson," he said, tapping a yellowed cutting. "Listen to this. Dated March 8th, 3 years ago, 2 days after Amelia Rosemere's acquittal. Mystery departure. Acquitted, widow, departs London under cover of night. It states she boarded the evening train to Portsmouth, reportedly accompanied by a woman in a dark veil. No ticket records under her name, no sightings afterward." "That supports the idea that she disappeared deliberately," I said. "But why, if she had been acquitted?" "Because, Watson, an acquittal in court is not always an absolution in society." Holmes leaned forward. "She may have feared retribution, scandal, or blackmail, or perhaps—" His eyes narrowed. "She knew something she dared not share." There was a sudden rap at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, holding a folded note. "Delivered just now, Mr. Holmes. No name, just the address. Quite insistently given, I must say." Holmes accepted it and unfolded the page. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, and unmistakably feminine. He was not the first. Find the other glove and you will understand. There was no signature. Holmes turned the paper in his hands, examining the edges, then sniffed it briefly. "Rose water," he murmured, "and a faint trace of bergamot. A woman's scent, but carefully chosen, perhaps even a disguise." I frowned. "Do you believe it's from Amelia Rosemere?" "I believe someone wants us to think so, but the phrasing, as he was not the first, is particularly compelling. It implies a pattern, perhaps a series." Holmes stood. "There is no more time to waste. We must return to the court archives. If a pattern exists, it will be buried in old transcripts. And perhaps—" He paused, looking at the glove in its paper wrapping on the desk. "Perhaps this killer or messenger has danced in the margins of more than one forgotten trial." We returned to the Central Criminal Court, this time under the veil of dusk. Mr. Bell had gone for the day, but Holmes had obtained permission to examine the archives under the supervision of a constable. The room smelled of old ink and older secrets, its shelves packed with brittle folders and sealed envelopes. Holmes moved quickly. "We begin by reviewing every trial over which Mr. Davies served in the last 5 years that resulted in a questionable acquittal or curious withdrawal of evidence. Focus particularly on those involving female defendants, lost exhibits, or suicides in the years following." I took to the files while Holmes worked with almost surgical precision. He read with the speed of a telegraph operator, scanning case after case, extracting only what he needed. After nearly 2 hours of silent labor, he placed his hand on a file and said, "Here, in this one." I leaned in, the Crown versus Lydia Winterbourne. Accused of poisoning her employer. Acquitted due to lack of motive and an absence of direct evidence. The final page of the transcript was missing, replaced by a handwritten note that read, "Filed in Box A17. Holmes's eyes flashed. "Box A17. Watson, check the catalogue." We located the box, its label faded, tucked beneath a shelf of maritime inquests. Inside were fragments of the Winterbourne file, most notably a photograph of the alleged poison bottle and a list of character witnesses. At the bottom was a folded glove, identical in style, size, and stitching to the one left at Newgate. Holmes held it up. Another left-hand glove, but note the difference. This one bears a stitched monogram on the interior, ER. Amelia Rosemere. Or someone who wants to link the cases through her. The implication is deliberate, but the logic is unstable. If she were responsible for both deaths, she would not sign her work so boldly. A low knock interrupted us. A young clerk entered, cap in hand. "Beg pardon, sirs, but I was told to give you this." He handed Holmes a calling card. Plain, cream-coloured. Mrs. Audrina Vale, proprietress, the Golden Heart boarding house. 13 Belgrave Mews, Wapping. Holmes's brows lifted slightly. We are being guided, Watson, but whether by friend or foe remains unclear. We made our way to Wapping through fog so dense it seemed to press against the carriage like a wall. Belgrave Mews proved to be a narrow alley flanked by crumbling stone and flickering lamps. The Golden Heart was a modest townhouse, poorly kept but respectable in structure. A woman opened the door before Holmes had finished knocking. She wore a dark dress, her hair pulled tightly back, and her expression unreadable. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice low and careful. "Come in, we haven't much time." The interior smelled of cedar and dust. She led us into a drawing room where heavy curtains concealed the windows. "I sent the note," she admitted as we took our seats. "But not the glove. That came from someone else. I found it in my wardrobe drawer yesterday morning. No message, just placed there." Holmes said nothing, but studied her carefully. "I knew Amelia," she continued. "She stayed here under another name for 2 weeks after the trial. She was pale, quiet, terrified of being seen. She told me she'd been warned, not by a stranger, but by someone in the courtroom. A man, a court officer." Holmes's eyes glittered. A threat? A warning that she hadn't truly escaped judgment, that if she didn't disappear, she'd vanish in another way. She left the next morning without saying goodbye. Watson spoke gently. "And you're telling us this now after 3 years because I saw that same man 2 nights ago on this street. He walked past and I recognized his gait, his posture. I followed him as far as the docks, then I lost him in the mist." "Can you describe him?" She hesitated. "Broad-shouldered, limp in the right leg, always wore gloves, even indoors." Holmes nodded. "One final question, Mrs. Vale. Have you seen any strangers near this building in recent days? Anyone watching?" Her lips tightened. "There was someone. A man in a long coat stood across the street for nearly an hour last night. Didn't speak, didn't smoke, just watched the window." Holmes rose. "Thank you. You've been braver than most." As we stepped back into the night, Holmes turned sharply. "We are dealing with a pattern, gloves, trials, vanishing women, and a man who believes himself executioner in the absence of the law. We must find him before he writes another chapter." "And what of the second glove?" "I expect," Holmes said, "it's already waiting for us, somewhere." We climbed into the cab once more, the mist swallowing us as we moved deeper into the hidden architecture of a crime not yet finished. The following morning found Holmes seated cross-legged upon the floor of our sitting room, surrounded by an array of documents, gloves, and a large hand-drawn map of London, marked with red ink at various points. I had returned from an early stroll to Baker Street Bakery, Holmes having no patience for breakfast when occupied by deduction, and stood watching him arrange a trio of notes like chess pieces across the map. "Observe, Watson," he said without lifting his gaze, "the deliberate geography. Newgate Prison, the Central Criminal Court, and now Belgrave Mews, all within a 4-mile corridor, and each connected not by random movement, but by orchestration." I set the parcel of bread on the table and peered over his shoulder. "You believe the killer is laying these clues within a constrained radius?" "Not merely constrained, designed. Whoever this is, they wish to remain tethered to the scene of the original trial, the theatre of their perceived injustice. Their movements form a pattern, Watson. We are not merely pursuing a murderer, but a mind steeped in symbolic revenge." He plucked the second glove, the monogrammed one, from the floor and held it up to the light. "This is not a copy, Watson. It is the glove, retrieved, preserved, and now reintroduced. But the crime it was attached to involved Lydia Winterbourne, not Amelia Rosemere, yet both gloves are identical. Then the gloves were never exclusive to a single woman, I ventured. They were tokens, perhaps gifted, or kept as trophies. Holmes stood suddenly and began to pace. Trophies, yes, but I suspect they were originally evidence. Each glove may have passed through the same chain of custody. And there's only one man with consistent access to both cases. Davies? Precisely. But he's dead. Holmes halted mid-stride. And therein lies our mystery. What did Davies learn in his final days that cost him his life? He had already seen the trial records, likely handled the gloves, and perhaps he recognized the pattern. But he did not act quickly enough. There came a knock at the door. This time it was Gregson himself, bearing a face deeply lined by both fatigue and worry. "You've stirred something, Holmes," he said, removing his gloves. "Last night, a constable found a third glove." Holmes stiffened. "Where?" "Thames Embankment, by the statue of Queen Boudica, tied to the rail, plain as day. No note, no blood. But here's the part that will twist your spine. It wasn't empty. Inside the glove was a gold ring, inscribed, "To L.W., Love Eternal." "Lydia Winterbourne's engagement ring," Holmes said, his voice low and tight. "Reported missing at the time of the trial. The prosecution speculated she had pawned it, but no record of it ever turned up, until now." Gregson nodded. "We've no idea how it ended up there. No witnesses, no footprints. It's like someone wants to rewrite the evidence, one glove at a time." Holmes stared into the fireplace for a long moment, then turned briskly. "Gregson, I need the surveillance records from Davies's last week. Phone calls, visitors, receipts, anything unusual." "You think someone approached him before his death?" "I think someone recruited him," Holmes replied grimly. "Or blackmailed him. Perhaps he was the custodian of a secret too dangerous to remain buried. And we need to determine who else stood in that courtroom 3 years ago. Someone who had access, motive, and memory." Gregson gave a short nod and left, the weight of the case clearly bearing down on him. As the door closed, Holmes turned to me with renewed intensity. "We must now go to the source, Watson. Not the court nor the prison, but the original home of the Rosemere case. Where the drowning occurred, where the trial began long before it reached a judge's ears." I blinked. "You mean the Rosemere's home in Richmond?" "Exactly. The house was sold shortly after the trial, but records should reveal the address. We may yet find something the police missed, perhaps even the third party who has eluded us thus far." The journey to Richmond was unremarkable, save for Holmes's growing impatience. The Thames wound lazily beside the road, dark and sluggish under the grey sky. The Rosemere house, once a fine Georgian residence, now bore signs of quiet neglect. Ivy crawled across its facade like veins, and the garden lay overgrown. The current owner, a Mr. Talloway, allowed us to explore, provided we touched nothing. "Bought the place in '93, he said. "Knew about the scandal, of course." "Who didn't?" "Gave me a decent discount, but I've kept to myself. Never found anything until last spring." Holmes perked up. "Go on." "In the attic, found an old chest behind the chimney flue, locked. Broke it open. Just dusty linens inside mostly, but at the bottom, this." He produced a faded ledger wrapped in oilskin. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside were pages of script in a narrow, fastidious hand. Amelia Rosemere's diary. "She kept records," Holmes murmured. "Notes on the trial, the lead-up, letters she never sent." I read over his shoulder. The entries were terse, but filled with undercurrents of fear. "April 10th, he knows. I saw him near the house again, always with gloves. He smiled when Henry fell. I swear he smiled. April 17th, spoke to Davies. He won't help. Says it's not his place. Coward. Still he looked pale. Perhaps he knows more than he admits. April 23rd. Leaving tomorrow. Adrena says she'll take me in. I will not wait for him to come again. If I vanish, let someone read this. Holmes shut the book. She was watched, stalked, possibly coerced, and the mention of a man who smiled when her husband drowned. What does that tell us, Watson? I hesitated. It suggests presence at the scene, a witness or an accomplice. Or, Holmes said darkly, an architect. We returned to London with the diary secured in Holmes's valise. It was late afternoon when we arrived, and the fog had thickened again, now tinged with the sour scent of coal smoke. Holmes wasted no time. He contacted Gregson, who promised to begin identifying all male court personnel with a limp history in the Richmond district and service during both the Rosemere and Winterbourne trials. By twilight, Gregson had responded with a name. Ephraim Gable, he said over the phone, former evidence clerk, injured leg from a coach accident, discharged 2 years ago for misconduct, tampering with exhibit storage, records buried, no charges pressed. Holmes nodded slowly. Gable. Of course, the shadow that moved through the court, always present, never questioned. He would have known the files intimately, enough to plant or remove at will. And he has vanished? Last known address in Bethnal Green. Tenant said he moved out a month ago, left no forwarding address. Holmes hung up and looked to me. Watson, it's clear now. Gable is the thread. He followed Amelia, perhaps tormented her, then waited, and when Davies grew too curious, he silenced him. Now he's laying out these gloves like trophies, each one not merely a clue, but a warning. A warning to whom? To us, Holmes said. To the system. To anyone who believes truth resides in the courtroom alone. He sees himself as a deliverer of justice, but justice shaped by bitterness becomes vengeance. He crossed to the desk and opened Amelia's diary once more, his eyes fixed on the last sentence she had written. If I vanish, let someone read this. We are reading, Amelia, Holmes said softly, and we are listening. The fog still clung to the window panes of Baker Street like a veil when Holmes lit his third pipe of the evening. The diary lay open on the table before him, its spine cracked but the ink remarkably legible. A quiet fire hissed in the grate. I sat across from him, nursing a cooling cup of tea, the weight of Amelia Rosemare's final entries pressing upon us both. Holmes had been silent for the better part of an hour, but not idle. He had drawn a list in his notebook, each entry a name, a date, or a place, and beside each a single letter, R, W, or G. I had come to understand these as references to the trials, Rosemere, Winterbourne, and the emerging Gable connection. The columns were narrowing. A pattern was forming. The gloves, Watson, Holmes murmured, his voice low and deliberate, are a cipher. I raised an eyebrow. A cipher? Not in the traditional sense, but their placement, their condition, and their accompanying objects all form a communicative structure. The first, left at the Gallows, connected to Davies, the handler of secrets. The second, found in the court archive, bore a monogram. The third, placed on the Thames embankment, held a ring, a memento of grief. He stood and moved to the fireplace. Each glove was left in a location of symbolic justice. Davies died at the Gallows. The ring re-emerged by the river where the first victim drowned. Our man is not merely recreating a history, he is judging those involved one by one. You believe Gable is following a moral sequence? No, Watson, not moral, ritualistic. He is rewriting history through carefully staged gestures. He does not act from impulse. These are rehearsed acts, deliberate and steeped in personal philosophy. There was a soft knock at the door. This time it was not Mrs. Hudson, but a telegram boy, pale and breathless from the climb. "For Mr. Holmes, sir. Marked urgent." Holmes opened it immediately, eyes scanning the telegram with rising intensity. Gable sighted at Mill Wharf. 20 minutes ago. Stop entered, derelict warehouse. Stop 2 constables sent in did not return. Stop Inspector Gregson requests your presence. Stop, he looked up. Mill Wharf again, the very clay I found on the glove from Newgate. Our killer returns to the source. Within minutes we were in a cab, jolting across the slippery cobbles, toward the Docklands. The rain had resumed, not heavy but persistent, and the mist along the river clung low to the earth like smoke. As we neared the old industrial quarter, the streets grew darker, narrower, littered with broken crates and the smell of salt, oil, and rot. Mill Wharf was more ruin than warehouse now. A crumbling 2-story structure of brick and iron, its windows boarded or broken, its lower level half submerged by the sluggish Thames. Gregson waited by the entrance, his coat sodden and lantern held high. "Holmes," he said grimly, "we've not heard from the constables." "They entered 15 minutes ago through the South Dock entrance. No signal since. We've kept the perimeter quiet." Holmes nodded and took the lantern. "Then we go in." "Watson, keep close." The interior of the warehouse swallowed the light almost at once. We advanced slowly, the floorboards groaning underfoot. Shadows danced across the rusted machinery and heaps of discarded nets. The smell of mildew and river decay was almost overpowering. We passed an abandoned office, a rusted staircase, and a row of locked crates before Holmes suddenly held up his hand. From somewhere deeper in the building came a sound, a faint creak, followed by the soft scrape of metal against wood. Then silence. Holmes motioned for us to follow, ducking through a narrow passage that led to a mezzanine overlooking the main warehouse floor. There, in the center of the space below, stood a figure. He was tall and broad, his limp unmistakable even from this height. He wore a heavy coat and gloves, and in one hand he held something small and pale. Another glove. On the floor near his feet lay 2 bodies, motionless. Holmes gestured for us to remain. He descended the steps soundlessly, circling toward the edge of the warehouse floor, while Gregson and I moved into position to block the exits. Then Holmes's voice rang out, clear and commanding. "Ephraim Gable." The figure turned slowly. The lantern light flickered over his face, lined, gaunt, and half consumed by shadow. He did not flinch. "I thought you would come," Gable said softly. His voice was calm, almost weary. "You are the last instrument left to this farce." Holmes stepped forward. "The 2 constables, are they alive?" "They're not dead," Gable replied. "Yet I bound them, left them untouched. They were not part of this. They are tools like I was, like Davies was, like you are. You've killed a man, perhaps more." "I revealed them," Gable said, almost reverently. "Exposed what was never judged. Davies knew. He handled the glove, saw the original. He tried to sell the truth. That was his mistake." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Sell it? To whom?" Gable's face twitched. "It doesn't matter. He was no better than the judges who acquit monsters because the evidence is slightly blurred. I watched them, Mr. Holmes. I filed their lies. I saw how truth was bent. I could not allow it to stand." "You believe yourself the hand of justice?" Gable lifted the glove. "This is the final one, the right-hand match. The other 3 were warnings. This one is the verdict." Holmes took a slow step forward. "And who is this one for?" "For her," Gable said almost in a whisper. "For Emilia." And then, abruptly, he dropped the glove. In that same instant Gregson surged forward and I followed. Holmes lunged, striking the glove mid-air and knocking it aside. Gable turned, reaching into his coat, but Gregson tackled him hard, driving him against the crates. I rushed to the fallen constables and found them dazed but unharmed, their hands bound with twine. Within minutes, Gable was shackled and under heavy guard. Holmes retrieved the glove and examined it carefully. "This one is different," he murmured. "No blood, no monogram, but something tucked into the fingers." He extracted a small, folded photograph, grainy and worn. It was of Amelia Rosemere, not at trial, but laughing in a garden, arm in arm with Henry Rosemere, and beside them, in the background, stood Ephraim Gable, unsmiling, distant, watching. Holmes sighed. This was never about justice. It was obsession, perhaps love, perhaps madness. But in the end, Gable crafted his own trial, his own sentence, and his own theatre. We stood outside the warehouse as dawn crept into the east. The sky was streaked with weak colour, and the mist had finally begun to lift. Holmes looked out over the river. He thought he was correcting the court, but truth, Watson, cannot be carved from vengeance, only distorted by it. I said nothing. The fog was gone, but the chill remained. And as we rode back to Baker Street, the image of the glove falling through the air, like a judgment passed by unseen hands, hung in my thoughts like a shadow that refused to dissolve. The streets of London were just beginning to stir with the first breath of morning as Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. Despite the hour, a thin grey light had settled over the city, neither quite dawn nor fully night. The mist that had cloaked the past few days was finally lifting, and with it perhaps the dense veil over the mystery we had been pursuing. Holmes said little on the cab ride back. His fingers drummed idly against the window-sill, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the river's edge, as if the silted waters still concealed some sliver of truth he had yet to uncover. When we finally entered our sitting room, he cast off his coat and gloves, moving immediately to his desk, where he laid out the gloves, now 4 in total, and the photograph discovered in Gable's final act. He stood there for a long moment as though reading them like a script. "Gable was no common killer," Holmes said at last, his voice flat. "He was methodical, delusional, and entirely convinced of the righteousness of his cause, yet for all his planning, his obsession with symbolism, something remains inconsistent." I glanced up from where I sat. "Inconsistent?" "We have the killer, Holmes," he confessed. "His trail connects to all 3 trials, the evidence tampered with, the victim selected, the gloves planted. It fits." Holmes turned slowly toward the fireplace. "No, Watson, it almost fits. That's the problem." He tapped the 4th glove. This was meant to be his final gesture, but Gable never intended to die. He staged the others like performances, elaborate, yes, but never impulsive. His theatre ended in capture, not climax. That was not his design. "You're suggesting someone else interfered?" Holmes nodded, the flicker of firelight glinting in his eyes. "Consider this. Gable plants a glove on the Thames embankment, yet he never returns to the Rosemere house to retrieve the diary. He knew it was there. He'd been in Richmond. And yet the diary sat untouched until our arrival. He crossed to his desk, opened the drawer, and withdrew a second photograph, one we had retrieved days ago from Davy's flat. It depicted the Central Court staff taken years before with Gable, Davies, and a third man, Mr. Carraway, the remaining court clerk who had been absent these past days in Surrey. Holmes laid the 2 photographs side by side. "There's our shadow," he murmured. "Gable was the hand, but the mind, there's every chance it was Carraway." I frowned. "But there's no evidence connecting him. Gable named no accomplice. He acted alone." Holmes's tone cooled. "Did he, Watson? Or was he merely the final actor cast into a play he believed he had authored? He was unstable, yes, but he was also steered. Consider the note that arrived at our flat. Find the other glove and you will understand. That was not Gable's language. He did not write like that. His rhetoric was clinical, obsessed with justice. That note was theatrical, almost taunting. The silence in the room deepened as I considered this. Holmes moved to the windowsill and stared out into the thinning morning haze. Carraway remained untouched throughout this entire affair, Holmes said. He was absent when Davies was killed, absent when the court was breached. Now, with Gable in custody and the city breathing easier, he will return thinking the game concluded. I rose. Then we speak to him directly. Holmes smiled faintly, though it did not reach his eyes. No, Watson, we draw him. The plan took shape swiftly. Holmes instructed Gregson to keep news of Gable's arrest out of the evening editions. No headlines, no statements. Instead, a false report was planted, suggesting Gable had escaped capture and vanished once again into the underworld of London. Meanwhile, Holmes arranged for the final glove, the one Gable dropped, to be discreetly displayed at the Central Criminal Court, under the pretense of a procedural hearing to reopen the Rosemere case due to new forensic findings. The bait was subtle, legal, and entirely irresistible to anyone with a personal interest in that trial. 2 days passed. The city moved on. Gable, now secured in a reinforced cell at Bow Street Station, remained silent, except for mutterings of justice and retribution. Holmes visited him once and returned more grim than before. He believes Carraway is dead, Holmes told me, that he died 3 years ago. That was how the plan was sold to him. Gable thinks he avenged the innocent and buried the guilty. It is not in his mind, but liturgy. The hearing was set for the following Monday. Holmes and I took our places in the viewing gallery early, with Gregson positioned just outside the chamber. The court buzzed quietly with a handful of legal staff and curious onlookers. Then, precisely at 10 minutes past 10, a figure entered. He was tall, clean-shaven, and wore the robes of a former clerk. His gait was calm, composed, and entirely too rehearsed. Carraway. He moved toward the clerk's bench at the rear, where the gloves had been laid out on exhibit under a glass case. He paused there, hands behind his back, and leaned forward just slightly, just enough. Holmes stood at once. Gregson. It took less than a minute. Officers moved in with quiet efficiency, sealing the chamber before Carraway could retreat. He made no struggle. As he turned, his face betrayed nothing but mild amusement. "Well done, Mr. Holmes," he said, with the faintest of smiles, "though I hoped you'd take longer." Holmes approached him slowly. "Gable was your sword, but it was your hand that pointed him. You fed him the names, the trials, the gestures. You needed him unbalanced, malleable." Carraway inclined his head. "There's truth in that, but he was willing. I gave him form. He gave me action." "And why?" Holmes asked. "Why orchestrate death from the shadows?" Carraway's eyes flicked to the gloves beneath the glass. "Because justice failed. Again and again. I watched men twist it, women escape it. The law bends, Holmes, but death is straight." Holmes said nothing. There was no point. As Carraway was led away, the fog of understanding lifted at last. We had been pursuing a ghost born from madness, but madness had only been the vessel. The true architect had stood at the edge of the system all along, quiet, orderly, invisible. His crimes had left no trace but the gloves, each one a whisper of a judgment passed in secret. That evening, Holmes sat before the fire once more, smoking in long silences. "Watson," he said at length, "it is one thing to defend society from criminals. It is another entirely to defend it from those who believe they are saving it." I nodded, the words of Amelia Rosemere echoing quietly in my mind. If I vanish, let someone read this. We had read, we had followed. And now, at last, we understood. The days that followed were, to the outside world, uneventful. The streets of London returned to their ordinary pace. The newspapers printed vague statements about a conspiracy exposed within the judicial archives. But the true depths of the affair were withheld, partly by Scotland Yard's discretion and partly by Holmes's insistence. The public appetite, he reminded me, was better left underfed in certain matters, particularly when justice itself had been contorted into a private theatre of vengeance. Yet within the quietude of 221B Baker Street, Holmes was not at rest. Carraway had been arrested, yes, and Gable remained under observation. The case, by all appearances, had been concluded, but Holmes, pacing with uncharacteristic agitation from the hearth to the window and back again, seemed unconvinced. "One thread remains," he muttered to himself one evening, pausing by the mantel where the 4 gloves lay, in a neat row beneath a glass dome. "One voice unaccounted for." I looked up from my journal. "You speak of Amelia Rosemere?" "Precisely." "But surely she's either long vanished, or worse." He turned. "That is the point, Watson. We have Gable's diary-like manifesto, Carraway's confession, Davies's involvement reconstructed through deduction. But Amelia, she remains only in fragments. A voice preserved in a diary, a shadow seen by Mrs. Vale, a footnote in her own story. She never testified again, never wrote to the court. She fled, but not, I think, because she was merely afraid. I believe she was told to vanish, and I believe someone helped her do so." I frowned. "But who?" "Gable watched her. Carraway orchestrated her silence. Who could have defied them?" Holmes didn't answer at first. He returned to his desk and pulled out a slip of paper from the envelope containing Amelia's diary. It was a letter, unfinished, crumpled, but bearing her unmistakable hand. "To whomever finds this, I am not safe. I cannot say more. If you believe me innocent, do not look to the court. Look to her. She knows what I could not prove." Holmes laid the letter down gently. Her, that's the final turn of the key. We reviewed every name mentioned in the Rosemere case. Friends, family, witnesses. One stood out not for prominence, but for silence. The housemaid, Cecily Morton. She had been scheduled to testify, yet the court records showed her statement was withdrawn at the last moment due to illness. No follow-up, no mention in Davies' notes. Simply erased from the narrative. Holmes tapped the entry. "Watson, you recall Mrs. Audrina Vale?" "The boarding-house keeper?" "Yes, she never mentioned Cecily Morton." And yet, curiously, her boarding-house, the Golden Hart, was originally listed under a different name in the city directory. Morton House. My heart quickened. "You believe Mrs. Vale is Cecily Morton?" "I believe," Holmes said quietly, "that Amelia's final protector did not vanish. She changed her name." We made for Wapping again at once, under cover of early evening. The streets had grown busier since our last visit, though the alley of Belgrave Mews remained as narrow and wind-blown as before. The Golden Hart's shutters were half-drawn, the light within subdued. Holmes rapped once, and after a brief hesitation, the door opened. Mrs. Vale stood before us, still dressed in widow's black. Her eyes flicked between us, then settled on Holmes with wary resignation. "You've come about her?" she said. "Amelia." Holmes gave a slight bow. "You were her maid at Rosemere House. You hid her when the court failed her. And you helped her escape when the men who should have protected her plotted instead." There was no denial. "I never expected anyone to ask," she said quietly, stepping aside to let us in. "Not after all these years. Come." She led us to the back room, a small parlour filled with the scent of rosemary and coal smoke. On the wall hung a faded photograph of a woman's silhouette on a riverside walk. Emilia, unmistakably. "She stayed with me after the trial," Mrs. Vale said. "I told the court she'd gone to Portsmouth, but she never did. She was too frightened. That night after the acquittal, she found a letter in her drawer. No name, just a line. 'Your verdict was not justice. You will not be safe.'" "Caraway," Holmes murmured. "Yes," she said, though we didn't know it then. She wanted to go to the police, but Davies told her not to. He warned her that the court was compromised. He wasn't brave enough to expose it himself, but he gave us money. Told us to vanish. I leaned forward. "Then Emilia still lives?" "She did, for a time. I moved her to a cottage outside Durham, under another name. She stayed there in quiet, no letters, no visitors, just a piano and a garden, for nearly 2 years. Holmes's voice softened. "And then?" Mrs. Vale closed her eyes for a long moment. "Last year she fell ill. Consumption. She died in spring. I buried her under the name Eleanor Reeves. There's a stone, nothing more." The room fell into silence. Holmes stood very still, one hand resting lightly on the mantel. I could see the weight of it in his posture, not grief, precisely, but something colder, sharper. The full shape of the story was now visible, and its ending was not triumph, but retreat. "Why did you never come forward?" he asked, not accusingly, but with quiet sorrow. She looked up, her eyes resolute. "Because Emilia asked me not to. She wanted no part in revenge. She feared what those men might do if they knew she lived. She asked me to burn the diary, but I could not, and now I'm glad I didn't." Holmes inclined his head. "Your silence preserved her peace, but your truth has helped settle what remains." As we left the house and stepped back into the damp London evening, Holmes paused on the narrow cobbled street and turned to look back at the shuttered windows. "Watson," he said softly, "we chase criminals through logic and method, through footprints and fibre and deduction. But what we forget, what they forget, is that justice is not a thing that waits in the court. Sometimes it lives in the quiet hands of those who choose kindness over fear." We returned to Baker Street in silence. The gloves remained under their glass dome, but Holmes now added one final object beside them. Emilia's photograph, and beneath it a card marked only with her final alias. Eleanor Reeves, 1863 to 1897. She vanished not in fear, but in defiance. The days that followed were hushed ones. Though the case had drawn to its resolution in the eyes of Scotland Yard, I could see that for Holmes the matter had not yet settled into the neat conclusions he so valued. The physical facts had been accounted for, the gloves, the victims, the perpetrators, but a lingering unease remained, something elusive that stirred just beneath the surface of our daily life at Baker Street. Holmes spent long hours at the window, staring out at the drifting carriages and the curling fog, his violin untouched beside him, the bow resting across its strings as if awaiting a final note. He reviewed Caraway's file in silence, the confession repeated to himself in quiet phrases. I recognized the signs. He was circling something, an angle still concealed, not doubt precisely, but a refinement. Late one evening, while I was penning my own account of the affair, Holmes spoke suddenly. "Watson, there is a detail that has continued to disturb me, a question no one has asked, though its implications are immense." I turned to him. "What detail?" He tapped a finger against the glass dome under which the gloves lay. "Why 4 gloves?" I frowned. We believed Gable placed one for each woman, Emilia Rosemere, Lydia Winterbourne, and the third case, which Caraway had hoped to bury. Holmes nodded. "Yes, and yet there is no 4th woman." No fourth trial tied to these events, at least none we've found. But the gloves tell a different story. They came in pairs, Watson. We've accounted for 4 gloves, but only 3 victims in the pattern. 1 glove remains unexplained. I sat back slowly. Are you suggesting there was another trial, another injustice that Carraway engineered? Not engineered, Holmes said, standing. Witnessed, enabled, and then concealed. He retrieved Amelia's diary once more and turned to a page we had previously overlooked, an entry penned in a more hurried, less steady hand. There was another, not me. She pleaded in whispers. He listened in silence. The verdict came too quickly. Holmes looked up. It was dismissed at the time as paranoia. A woman on the verge of collapse, but now I wonder. He returned to his desk and drew out the trial register for the year preceding the Rosemere affair. One entry had been struck through with ink, but the indentation remained legible. The Crown versus Helena Forsyth. There were no documents in the file, no transcript, no evidence log, not even a verdict. Effaced, Holmes murmured, as if it never occurred. We rode at once to the Central Criminal Court, this time under pretence of confirming an archival discrepancy. Mr. Bell, ever courteous, allowed us access to the restricted filing room. Holmes moved with purpose, cross-referencing old docket ledgers against sealed boxes. After nearly an hour, he pulled a worn leather folio from the shelf and opened it with gloved fingers. Inside was a brief summary, 1 page only. Accused, Helena Forsyth. Charge arson with intent to kill alleged victim, Cornelius Forsyth, husband. Outcome. Trial postponed indefinitely. File sealed. No witnesses listed, Holmes noted. No prosecutor's notes. No ruling on admissibility. A sealed case, buried and forgotten. He turned to me. Watson, Helena Forsyth is our missing 4th voice. But why bury the trial? I asked. If the evidence was insufficient, why not dismiss it openly? Holmes's expression grew grim. Because someone intervened, someone who had already begun to understand the levers of silence. Carraway. He sealed this trial before the court could deliberate, perhaps even before Helena could speak. We found her name in the public register. Born in Sussex, daughter of a coal merchant, married into the Forsyth family, then vanished after the trial's cancellation. No death record, no emigration, merely disappeared. Holmes's fingers drummed once more on the folio. 4 gloves, 4 women, 3 who suffered publicly, 1 who was erased entirely. I suspect she survived, as Amelia did. But unlike Amelia, she had no diary, no boarding house, no one to protect her. Unless... He trailed off and looked sharply at me. Watson, what if she didn't vanish? What if she remained in London, quiet, invisible, and someone kept watch over her? I blinked. Carraway? He silenced her. But Gable... Holmes's voice lowered. Gable may have pitied her. We returned to Bow Street Station under urgency, requesting access to Gable once more. Gregson, though surprised, acquiesced. The former evidence clerk was pale and listless, his madness subdued since the arrest, but his eyes flicked up at the sight of Holmes with a faint ember of recognition. "You came back," he said. Holmes sat across from him. "You left 4 gloves, 1 too many. Helena Forsyth, where is she?" Gable blinked slowly. "She wasn't part of it." "She was. You kept her name hidden even from Carraway." "She had nothing left," Gable said, quieter now. "He beat her, tried to burn her in her bed. She escaped through smoke and shame. They arrested her on his word." Alone. Carraway sealed it, said it was better for the court's image. Where is she now? I visited her once, years ago, gave her money. She never asked where it came from. She just cried and said she wouldn't speak again. She lives near Smithfield, sewing work. She calls herself Nora. Holmes rose gently. "You did a wicked thing, Mr. Gable, but you spared her. For that at least I believe you sought atonement." We found Helena, or Nora, as she now lived, in a dim third-floor flat above a haberdasher's in Smithfield. She was thin, her hands calloused, her eyes deep and cautious. But she remembered Holmes's name. "I thought this would come one day," she said quietly. "I thought the silence wouldn't last forever." Holmes said nothing, only offered her a seat and placed the glove gently on the table between them. She stared at it, then reached for it without touching. "It was mine, the day of the trial. They took it when I arrived in the dock. I never got it back." We listened as she spoke, not of vengeance, nor of grief, but of the slow, determined work of survival. She had refused bitterness even after the court abandoned her. She had lived on, as Amelia had, but with no stone, no journal, only silence. Holmes stood and bowed to her before we left. It was the first time I had seen him do so without words. Back at Baker Street, he placed the fourth glove in the case. No longer a cipher, no longer an enigma. It joined the others as a testament not to crime but to truth buried and truth recovered. 4 gloves, 4 voices, at last, all heard. It was a rainless dusk in Baker Street when Holmes, without ceremony, removed the glass dome from the cabinet and carefully lifted the 4th glove. He held it as one might a sacred object, neither trophy nor evidence, but something that had transcended both. For a moment he said nothing, only stared at the delicate curve of its stitching, the faint crease at the base of the thumb where time had softened its form. Then, with his usual economy of motion, he placed it into a separate wooden box, locked it, and set it on the highest shelf in the sitting room. I watched him closely, aware that we were nearing the true end, not merely of the case, but of the long arc that had first begun with a body on a gallows and a glove tied like an invitation. The air in the room felt clearer now, as though some pressure that had lain unseen over the past fortnight had finally lifted. Holmes poured himself a measure of brandy and leaned against the mantel. "It is curious, Watson, how justice so often depends on voices that are almost never heard in courtrooms. Amelia, Helena, Lydia, each one rendered powerless by process, yet each one carried within her the weight of an untold truth." I nodded slowly. "And what of Carraway and Gable? Will they face full charges?" "Carraway will stand trial for conspiracy, obstruction, and accessory to manslaughter in the death of Davies. He is composing a narrative, as men like him do, one of misunderstood motives and systemic failures. It will not save him. Gable's fate is less straightforward. He's mad." "Yes, but not in the way the courts prefer," Holmes said quietly. "He is lucid in patches, brilliant in others, and completely unfit in the spaces between. There's talk of Broadmoor. Gregson has requested my testimony." "And will you provide it?" Holmes swirled the brandy in his glass. "I shall tell the truth, no more, no less." There came a knock at the door, 3 brisk raps, evenly spaced. Mrs. Hudson entered a moment later with a telegram in her hand. "This just arrived, Mr. Holmes. Delivered by courier. The man didn't wait." Holmes opened it slowly. His eyes moved across the page, then once more to confirm. He handed it to me without comment. From Inspector Tobias Gregson. Received confession from Carraway, confirming he sent false letter to Amelia Rosemere following verdict. Content matched diary. No record kept. Sealed file, labelled special handling. Additional material recovered. You were right. I looked up from the paper. So he admitted it? The note Amelia received wasn't just real, it was part of an internal scheme. Holmes nodded. A private mechanism within the court, special handling. A euphemism for suppression used to bury inconvenient cases. Carraway was not merely corrupt, he institutionalized his discretion. He wasn't covering up singular crimes, he was pruning the legal garden. But what additional material? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. That, I suspect, we are about to learn. He was correct. By mid-morning the next day, Gregson arrived at our door, hat in hand, the lines of fatigue drawn sharply across his brow. He carried with him a brown ledger case, wrapped in oilskin and marked with a curious red wax seal bearing the court's insignia, one I had never seen before. We found it, Gregson said, buried deep, a sealed registry used by Carraway and, possibly others, 43 case files, all suppressed. Holmes accepted the case carefully. All women? Gregson hesitated. 38 of them, yes. The rest, political matters, matters of influence, bribery, quiet dissolutions. But the pattern is clear. Carraway had a private index. Holmes moved to the table, opened the ledger, and turned the pages slowly. Each file bore only the briefest summary. Name, date, reason for suppression. No verdicts, no commentary, just silences bound together like a ledger of ghosts. Will they be reopened? I asked quietly. They must be, Gregson replied. The Crown will face public pressure to answer, but many of the defendants are gone. Some may be dead. Some may have fled the country. It's a long road. Holmes closed the ledger. Then we begin where we can, with the truth. Gregson nodded and departed soon after, leaving the sealed registry in Holmes's care. For the rest of the day, Holmes made no effort to study the files nor even to speak. He left the ledger unopened on the desk while he played the violin, melancholy strains that wound through the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. It was not until that evening, as we sat before the hearth, that Holmes finally spoke again. Watson, I sometimes wonder if what we call justice is less a pillar than a tightrope, stretched between truth and power. Most tread it, believing they are safe. Others fall without notice. He gestured toward the glove case. And yet in that very fall, some leave behind threads strong enough to lead us back. Amelia's diary, Helena's silence, Gable's madness, Carraway's hubris, they all formed a map. I stared into the fire. But maps only work if someone's willing to follow them. Holmes gave a rare smile. Then let us continue to walk it, as long as there is ink and breath. We retired late that night, but I could not sleep. Instead, I returned to my chair and opened my notebook, pages already brimming with this strange, harrowing case. I found myself writing the names again, Amelia, Lydia, Helena, and beneath them one line. Not every verdict is a gavel on wood. Some are written in gloves and silence, and even as the fire dimmed and the wind pressed gently at the window, I felt, for the first time in many days, a kind of peace. The following morning broke with unusual clarity. London, so often draped in fog and soot, revealed itself beneath a cold, polished sky of pale blue. The sunlight filtering through the windows of 221B Baker Street lent an unnatural brightness to the corners of the sitting room, as if the city itself sensed the shift that had come over the air. Yet even in that light, Holmes sat in shadow, his chair turned away from the warmth, the registry case from Gregson still unopened, on the table before him. He was reading, though not from the files. Instead, he held a slender book, bound in green cloth, its spine worn, the pages heavily annotated. I recognized it instantly, a volume of Blackstone's commentaries, one of Holmes's earliest legal references, though he had not touched it in years. It had been relegated to the back of our shelf beside a dusty volume on apocryphal Roman trials. I made no remark at first, but after several minutes of his silence, I said gently, "You're thinking about what comes after." He nodded without looking up. Justice, Watson, has never been a static pursuit. It is something recalibrated by every generation, shaped not only by law, but by who is allowed to speak. These files, he gestured toward the sealed ledger, they contain the names of the silenced. To reopen them is not simply to pursue forgotten crimes. It is to re-examine the foundation of our profession, and that will not be done without resistance. You fear the system will refuse to listen. I fear it will listen just long enough to appear noble, then quietly turn away again. His voice had no bitterness in it, only a subdued clarity. It was rare to see Holmes contemplative in this way, not because he lacked introspection, but because he so often folded it inward, tucked away like his pipe or violin when not in use. This time, however, it remained visible, a burden unshaken. Shortly before noon, a knock came at the door. It was not Gregson this time, but a young woman of perhaps 30, plainly dressed, but with a certain alertness in her bearing. She held a letter in her gloved hand. "Mr. Holmes?" she asked. "My name is Eleanor Havisham. I was told to come to you by someone who knew what happened." Holmes, already rising, gestured her inside and offered her a seat. "Please, Miss Havisham, who sent you?" She looked down at the letter, then held it out. The envelope was addressed in a precise, almost delicate hand, but unsigned. Holmes opened it and read, then passed it to me. She was my aunt. I do not seek vengeance, only truth. Her name was Lydia Winterbourne. If others were lost the same way, they deserved to be known. Holmes's brow furrowed. "You knew nothing of the trial?" "I was a child when it happened. My parents told me she'd drowned. Only recently, when clearing out an old estate record, did I find a clipping about her arrest. And then I came across something else." She opened her handbag and produced a glove, aged, matching in style to the others. It was tucked into an old sewing kit in the attic. With it was a letter, a single page. My aunt wrote it before the verdict. She said if anything happened to her, someone would try to make it seem accidental. Holmes took the glove, studying it with care. "And you found this after the case reopened?" She nodded. "I didn't know what it meant. I just thought, if there were others, you might understand." Holmes turned the glove in his hands. "This is the original, the one Davies substituted out. He must have given it back to her secretly, or hidden it where she could reclaim it." "And the letter?" I asked. She looked down again. It was brief, but it named someone, Ephraim Gable. She said he stared at her from the moment the trial began, that she feared him more than the jury. Holmes set the glove beside the others. "Then it confirms it. Gable's obsession began earlier than we thought. Carraway may have wielded control over the system, but Gable made it personal." He stood slowly. "Miss Havisham, your decision to come here, do you understand what it may invite? There will be inquiries, testimony, exposure." She looked him in the eye. If I remained silent, I'd only be continuing the silence they forced on her. I didn't know my aunt, but if I can give her name back, then it's enough. Holmes bowed slightly. "Then I will see to it that her name is not lost again." She departed soon after, leaving behind the glove, the letter, and an unexpected clarity. Holmes was quiet for a long while, standing at the mantel, fingers steepled as he watched the light shift across the wall. Finally he said, "It ends where it began." Not with a crime, but with a warning unheeded. Davies tried to help, Gable tried to judge, Carraway tried to erase, and the victims tried only to be believed. I stood and crossed to the window. Outside, London moved as it always did, unaware, uninterrupted. Carriages rolled past, a lamplighter in the distance adjusted a wick, and a child with a kite trailed across the square like an arrow from some forgotten war. Holmes turned back toward the files. There will be more. Not all of them will reach us. Some names will remain buried, some voices too faint to trace. But we have this moment, and we have made it count. That night, as I wrote the final lines of my account, far longer than most cases we had handled, I felt not closure exactly, but completion. We had followed the trail of gloves and shadows through prisons, courtrooms, and drawing rooms. We had heard voices thought silenced, recovered truths once erased. And somewhere in the echoes of Lydia's glove, Amelia's diary, and Helena's silence, I imagined I heard not sorrow, but recognition. Holmes lit his pipe. You know, Watson, there is a curious line in Cicero, silent enim leges inter arma. The laws fall silent amid arms, but he forgot to add, so too do the innocent. I put down my pen. And what then? Then someone must listen. We sat there in quiet, the fire drawing long shadows across the floor, the gloves still resting beneath the glass. They no longer accused, they bore witness. The final days of the case unfolded not with spectacle, but with the slow, deliberate weight of reckoning. The Crown moved to unseal the 38 suppressed files, naming a commission to review each with fresh eyes. Victims' names were published, carefully, respectfully, and appeals for witnesses reopened cases long thought resolved. Scotland Yard received more letters in 2 weeks than it had in the previous 3 months combined, from relatives like Eleanor Havisham, each bearing fragments of truth once buried beneath shame and silence. Holmes declined public praise. He had no patience for accolades in newspapers or formal thanks in chambers. Yet the change in him was noticeable. He rose earlier, took more walks, and began each morning not with his usual silence, but with questions, curious, searching, humane. The case had not softened him, but it had deepened him. I observed, too, that he no longer glanced over the glove case on the mantel with the same calculating detachment. There was now something else in his eyes when he looked at it. Recognition, perhaps even reverence. Still, one matter remained. We were seated in our rooms on a Sunday afternoon, a thin mist curling at the corners of the window panes, when Holmes tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair and said, "Watson, we never discovered who sent the first note." I looked up from the paper. The one that arrived after Davy's death, the glove message. Precisely. Gable claimed no knowledge of it. Carraway, when confronted, denied ever authoring it. And yet it led us directly into the heart of the matter. He stood, crossed to his desk, and retrieved the note. The paper had long since been examined for ink, pressure marks, even faint traces of perfume. It remained maddeningly neutral. Someone, Holmes said, desired the truth to surface, but could not act openly. Someone who had remained close to the events, but not a victim, not a perpetrator, a witness. He turned to me. Cecily Morton. I blinked. Mrs. Vale? Holmes gave a slow nod. She took a new name to protect Amelia, but she did more than provide shelter. She remained in proximity. She knew Gable lingered. She knew Davies had grown uneasy. And when he died, she did what she could not do 3 years earlier. She spoke. He drew a fresh sheet of paper and laid the anonymous note beside it. From a small folio, he extracted a letter, one Mrs. Vale had written during our earlier visit. Holmes had obtained it quietly, for reference. Now he matched the slant of the capital letters, the elegant flourish of the lowercase s, the soft curvature of E. It was not proof enough for a court, but it was more than enough for Holmes. She guided us, he said, without ever stepping forward. She did what the law could not. She started the process. I let out a breath. And she'll never be recognized. No, Holmes agreed, and that is how she would want it. The following week, we journeyed once more to Wapping. Holmes carried no satchel, no gloves, no notebook, only a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Mrs. Vale greeted us at the door, unsurprised, as though she had known this moment would come. Holmes handed her the parcel. "The case is closed, but your part in it is not forgotten." She accepted it quietly, untying the string to reveal the green-bound volume of Amelia's diary, now cleaned and preserved. "She would have liked this," Mrs. Vale said softly. "She always believed words had weight, even if no one listened." "They listened," Holmes said gently. "Eventually." We did not stay long. The walk back to the carriage was quiet, but I sensed a completion in Holmes's steps. The gloves had borne their tale, the ledger had been unlocked, and the web had been followed to its final strand. That night, back at Baker Street, Holmes sat again before the fire. The glove case now held a final addition, a small brass plaque affixed to its wooden base. 221B Private Archive. The glove left at the Gallows, 4 victims, 4 trials, 1 truth. I poured 2 small brandies and handed one to Holmes. "You've solved more elaborate crimes," I said, "unmasked more exotic criminals, but this felt different." Holmes didn't answer right away. He studied the fire for a long moment, then looked toward me. "There is no greater puzzle, Watson," he said quietly, "than what people choose to remember, and what they are made to forget." Then he raised his glass. I did the same. "To memory," he said, "and to the ones who never stopped watching." We drank in silence. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the square's trees. The world continued on. But in one small flat in Baker Street, justice, for once, had not been content with silence. And I, for my part, would not let the world forget what Sherlock Holmes had uncovered beneath the weight of one woman's vanished voice, one man's buried guilt, and a single white glove left tied to a beam of wood where justice had once been mocked and had finally, quietly prevailed.